Hey, and welcome back to Info Gamer. Thanks for tuning in. In this video, we're going to keep building our Flappy Bird game. In the last video, we showed you how to create the prefabs for the pillars or the pipes that will be moving across the screen. In this video, we want to start instantiating or spawning them into our scene, and we're going to have them move across the screen, and then when they go off the side of the other side of the screen, we're going to destroy them or delete them from our scene. But there's a few things that we need to fix from the last video, just minor tweaks. The first one is really simple and easy to fix. We need to go to our pipes prefab that we created in our last video, and when we drag it into the scene, you can see that when we adjusted our sprites so that the pivot point was at the end of the pipe, it didn't change the box collider that we put on it. And this is because you really want to wait until after you've altered your sprites as much as you're going to. Once you've altered your sprites, then you want to apply your box collider, and it should automatically fit the box collider to the size of your sprite. But since we altered our sprites after we applied the box collider, the box collider didn't change, and so you can see that the green line goes from the top of the screen to the bottom of the screen, when in reality what we want is we want one box collider to go from the middle of the screen to the top of our top pipe, and then from the middle of the screen to the bottom of our bottom pipe. And to fix this, it's really simple. All we need to do is select both pipes, the ones that are child to our parent object and the ones that have the box collider applied to it. And then we want to click on this little gear on the box collider and then hit reset. Now you can see that the green line goes around each sprite. So one for the top pipe and one for the bottom pipe. The next fix that we need to do is inside the pipe script. So we'll go and open our pipe script in Visual Studios. Once you have it open in Visual Studios, it's only part of this line of code and this line of code that we're going to be fixing, and it's where we've assigned the x value to be 0. For some reason, I thought that 0 would put it at the center point of its parent object, but for some reason when you're working with 2D, it actually puts it in the center of the world. So it's not local space, but it's world space. And so to fix this, all we need to do is change this 0 in the x parameter for our vector 2 to transform dot position dot x, and we're going to do the same thing for the other 0. So transform dot position dot x. So this is grabbing the parent object because the script is attached to the parent object, and it's looking for its position and then its x component of its position, and that'll center our object on the parent object, or our two pipes on the parent object. Let's go ahead and save that, and now we can go back to Unity. Once in Unity, we want to make sure that we select our pipes and hit apply. This will make it so that the changes that we made in our scene view will be applied to all the prefabs, or just our prefab object, you could say. Now we can go ahead and delete our pipes from our scene. Next, we're going to create a game controller script, and this is going to do a number of things inside our game once we're finished, but right now it's just going to spawn our pipes into our scene, and maybe a few other things. But let's go ahead and create that script. We'll create C# script, and let's call it game controller. And let's open it in Visual Studios. Once you have it open in Visual Studios, there's a couple of variables that we need to create. So the first one is going to be a public game object, and it's going to be our pipe prefab. This is going to hold our prefab so that we can reference it, and this is how we're going to instantiate or spawn this object into our scene. The next one is going to be a public transform, and it's going to be a pipe spawn. Now there's 3 more variables that we need, and these are all going to be related to time. And so they're going to be float variables, so public float. The first one is going to be min time. The second one is going to be public float max time. And the third one, or the final one, is going to be public float timer. Once you have all those variables, let's go ahead and create a new function. And this is going to be the function that holds all the code that we need to instantiate a new pipe. So let's call it void, and let's call it pipe spawner. We want to call it pipe spawner because we already have a pipe spawn, and so we don't want to have the names of our function and our variable get confused. So pipe spawner, let's open it up, and inside this we're going to call it the instantiation function, which is a Unity specific function used for spawning objects into the scene. So this is going to be instantiate, and it's a function, so it asks for a number of parameters. The first one is the object that we want to spawn into our scene, and that is our pipe prefab. The next one is going to be the position that we want this object to spawn in, and so it's going to be pipe spawn dot position. You need to make sure that you call it the position, because otherwise it'll think that you want to parent or child this object to that transform. Next, we want to set the rotation, and since it's just going to be 0, 0, 0, we can also use the pipe spawn for this, because that's going to have a 0, 0, 0 rotation. So pipe spawn dot rotation, and that's that line of code. Now what we need to do is reset our timer. So this is going to be timer equals random dot range. The min value is going to be our min time, and the max value is going to be our max time. So that's everything for our pipe spawn function. Now we want to call this function in our update function, but we don't want it to execute every frame, which is what update does. Instead, we want to instantiate it when the timer reaches 0. And so to do this, we're going to use the timer variable in a if statement. So if, and then inside the condition we're going to write timer is less than or equal to 0. And the reason why we would want to use less than or equal to 0 is when we're subtracting time from our timer, it's very unlikely that it's going to always exactly hit 0. Most of the time it's going to go a small value below 0, so in the negative value. And so we want to check for that condition. So if it's equal to 0, if it's perfectly at 0, then we want to reset the timer. Or if it's less than 0, we want to reset the timer. So to reset the timer, we want to call our pipe spawner function, pipe spawner, parentheses, semicolon. So this is going to say, oh, the timer has reached 0, so I want to instantiate a new pipe, and I want to reset the timer. Now all we need to do is have something that decrements the timer. And to do that, we want to type timer minus equals time dot delta time. This line of code is the same as writing it like this. Timer equals timer minus time dot delta time. So delta time looks at the last frame in which our game was updated and measures the time between that frame and the current frame, and that's the amount of time that it subtracts from our timer. So in a sense, this is going to be a real-time timer. But both these lines of code, both timer minus equals time.delta time and timer equals timer minus time.delta time, do exactly the same thing. They're just a little bit different when it comes to the syntax. So let's go ahead and save this and then go back to Unity. Inside Unity, we need to create an empty object that's going to hold this game controller script. So let's go create empty. I'm going to rename it to game controller. Then I'm going to drag on our game controller script into the inspector with it selected. Now we need to set a couple variables in our inspector. So the first one is pipe prefab. So to set this, we go to our prefabs folder and drag our pipes object into the pipes prefab. The next one is the pipe spawn, which we actually haven't created yet. So I'm going to make sure I center our game controller script so we know where it is in our scene. And then we need to go and create our pipe spawner. So create empty, because all we need is the transform. Let's call this pipe spawn. And now let's center it in the Y direction. And we want to drag it out in the X direction so that it is somewhere off the right side of our screen. So I'm going to put it at +5, and that'll be off the right side of our screen. Now what we need to do is go back to our game controller script and drag on our pipe spawner into the pipe spawn variable. Now we need to set the timers, so min time we want to have maybe at 2 seconds and max time at 5 seconds. So this will make it so that when we randomly choose a time for our timer, it'll choose somewhere between 2 and 5. And we're going to leave timer at 0 because we want a pipe prefab to spawn at the very first instance. So let's go ahead and test this out. So I'm going to hit the play button. And you can see that they're spawning, but because I haven't applied a movement script to our pipes yet, they haven't started moving. So let's go ahead and do that. With our pipe prefab selected in the project window, let's go ahead and add our movement script. So I'm going to find our movement script, click on it, and drag it into the inspector. Now we need to set the movement speed, and since we were using 5 for our movement speed at the ground, let's do 5 for the movement speed of our pipes. Now let's go ahead and hit play, and you can see that they're moving across the screen, and when the timer runs out, select our game controller script, you can see that a new instance of our pipe is spawned. So anytime our timer goes below 0, a new pipe spawns and our timer gets reset. So that's awesome. Now what we need to do is delete our pipes when they go off the side of the screen, the left side of the screen. So to do this, let's actually go to our pipe setup script. Now, because we have the top and bottom game objects, we can use those and the sprite renderer component of those objects to see whether or not our objects are visible. But we only want to see if they're visible if their position is less than 0. So let's create a new function that's going to check both these conditions. So I'm going to say void, and then let's call it pipe remover. Parentheses, curly braces, let's open it up. Before we write anything inside this function, let's go ahead and create 2 private variables to hold the sprite renderer component of both our top and our bottom pipe. So private sprite renderer, let's call it ren top, and then private sprite renderer ren bottom. And then inside our setup function, let's assign values to both these variables. So we're going to type ren top, is equal to top dot get component. In carets, we're going to type sprite render, and then we need parentheses and a semicolon. Now let's do the same thing for our ren bottom. So ren bottom equals bottom dot get component, carets, sprite render, parentheses, semicolon. Now we can use these to check to see if they're visible, because the visible aspect of a game object is always on the renderer. Whether it is a sprite renderer or a mesh renderer, it's going to have a boolean that checks to see whether it's visible. So let's create an if statement inside our pipe remover function, and the first thing that we're going to check for is if our transform.position.x is less than 0. Inside this if statement, we're going to write another if statement, and this is going to check to see if both our ren top and our ren bottom are visible. So to do this, we actually want to type exclamation point to flip the value, and then ren top dot is visible, and exclamation point ren bottom dot is visible. So the exclamation point flips the value because is visible returns a true or false value. If it's true, then we don't want this to execute because that means that it's still in our camera view. But if it's false, then we want it to execute so that it'll destroy the object. And so this is the same as writing an if statement that's like this: ren top dot is visible is equal to visible is equal to false. Yeah, insert bond. Yeah, so if I were to write ren top dot is visible is equal to false and ren bottom dot visible is equal to false, it would be the same as just doing this, because an if statement will execute if all the conditions are true when you're using an and operator. And so if we have false values and we flip those, then they become true and our if statement will then execute. Same thing as the comparison with false. If we do ren top dot visible and that equals false and we compare it with false, then that statement becomes true and the if statement will then execute. But inside this if statement, we want to then destroy the parent object. So we're going to type destroy, and then in parentheses, because it's a function, we type this dot game object. Now the last thing that we want to do before we go back to Unity and test the script is to make sure that we call our pipe remover function in the update function. So pipe remover parentheses semicolon. So let's go ahead and save this and go back to Unity and test it out. So we'll hit play, and you can see in our hierarchy we have our pipes that are spawning, our pipe clones. So this is coming from our game controller script, and then as the pipes themselves go off screen, they check to see whether they're visible. If they're not, then they destroy themselves. So it's not until it goes off our camera view then it destroys itself. And to be technical, if we were only viewing our game scene, then they would actually delete a lot sooner. But you can see that it's not until the pipes leave our scene view that they get deleted. And the reason why is because objects visible in our scene view are still visible technically, even though I've always thought that it should just be relevant to the game camera because that's what you're using. You're not going to be using your scene view. So that's everything that we're going to cover in this video. In our next video, we'll probably work a little bit on our ground so that it doesn't just go off the side of the screen. We're going to make sure that it repositions itself so it can keep repeating. And we will also probably work on our score because the ground really won't take us that long. But we'll work on adding score to the player for the next video. So I hope this video was helpful and that you understood everything. If there was anything that was confusing or you need help on, make sure you leave your questions and comments below. Make sure that you like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Bye.